Good evening, everybody. My name is Christina, and I'm with Atlantic Institute. Tonight, we are in our first book club meeting of our third book in 2023. And we have with us Dr. Siegrist. He is going to talk with us. The book is called Marvels of the Heart. There's a lot more to the book. He might be able to tell you the rest of the title of that. But and yeah, we have Akif over here holding the book up. So we're going to go ahead and let him go ahead and start and take it away.
Okay, so, I guess it might be good to tell a little bit about Al Ghazali first. He's one of the greatest. People might argue about where to place him, but certainly the top two or three greatest thinkers in the history of Islam, just in terms of the vast learning and this book, The Marvels of the Heart, is book 21 of the Revival of the Religious Sciences, which was a massive project. It's comparable to Thomas Aquinas's Summa Theologica in scope. So, Summa Theologica is basically a Christian vision of reality, as a whole. And he didn't finish it, Thomas, but he has a very interesting story too, Ghazali. He was a brilliant guy. Obviously, he became a teacher, a professor, became renowned. Students came from all over to be his student. But he kind of had a personal crisis. One day during class, he was teaching, and suddenly he realized he didn't feel authentic. He didn't feel like he was like he felt that he was speaking on an abstract level and not connecting on a spiritual level, I guess. And so he literally walked out of class, and all of his students were just like, "What?" And he didn't come back. He went out and really pursued some a mystical mentor, and spent some years pursuing mystical experience and and so on. And then he came back after that experience and sort of did everything different. He was somebody who mastered all the knowledge of the world had to offer at the time, but he realized he felt that it was empty. There was actually a very specific story that set it all off. He was traveling one day, and some bandits came upon his caravan, and they said, that you're going to take all this stuff. And he had his manuscript for, some all his work, and they were going to take it. And he said, "Take anything else, but please don't take my manuscript. That's priceless." And one of the bandits said, "Are you telling me that if we take this, you're nothing?" And he that really got to him. He's like, "Do I have something to offer in terms of who I am, in terms of my own spiritual status, if you want to put it that way?" And that started the train going. So anyway, so he writes this Marvels of the Heart. I guess the way I'd like to start off with it is with you all's first impressions. I mean, first of all, did you find it very difficult to read? I know it's a very deep book, and I welcome any comments.
I was going to say, so you can go ahead and unmute yourself if you want, or if you feel more comfortable and want to put something in the chat, you can, and I can read it to Scott and aloud for everybody.
Yeah, as well, I think, yeah.
Well, I'll jump in since in my lifetime, have had to read a lot of Thomas Aquinas. So when I got started on this, of course, I thought right away of Thomas Aquinas because Aquinas tapped into, what he called Avicenna and Averroes. So he was familiar with Islamic thought, Jewish thought, and scripture and church fathers and all that. But kind of the analytic approach was very reminiscent of how Thomas would divide and describe and break down this kind of intellect, that kind of intellect, categorizing qualities of the heart and so on. Right. And the other thing was the way in which Al-Ghazali prizes the mystic over the theologian. And the experience you referenced reminded me of one that was toward the end of Thomas Aquinas's life, after he'd written tome after tome and said that it was all straw. Yes. Compared to a kind of a vision of God that he had.
Right. I thought about that as I was
yeah talking. So I mean, a lot of parallels.
Yes it's kind of like, it reminds me of one of the big influences on all of those that you just mentioned were, of course, the Greek philosophers.
Yes, especially Aristotle.
And it reminds me of one of the things Plato said in his 7th letter, that that he didn't write down anything he didn't write down any of the stuff that was really important. something along those lines, right? It was like, and I think maybe the point was that the thing itself, or what's really most important, it cannot be put into words. And it's this existential, spiritual level, and and so that is where he's coming from. I think, and sometimes Ghazali is criticized by, I guess, more fundamentalist Muslims for being too influenced by the Greeks and that kind of thing. But I think he takes a very similar attitude to Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas learned, as you said, from Muslim thinkers and Jewish thinkers and Greek thinkers. And I think Thomas, I can't remember the way he put it, but it was along the lines of, if truth is one, it doesn't matter where you find it.
Right.
It shouldn't have to come from your group,
mm-hmm.
to accept it. So, good. Let's go to the text then. I'm interested to hear from any of you what your first impressions were about. I mean, I just heard yours, this analytical approach. What else jumped out at you guys? You can see this is my Socratic. This is what I do in the classroom. I can't really break myself of it, so didn't prepare a lecture. I just came in to talk about the book. Yes,
Scott, if you open this to a Socratic discussion, then I think you and we will spend an entire night together. So I mean, I'm in the very opposite side, and love to kind of hear and just be part of conversation. But even though there are a lot of things I love to share, but I'm kind of more impressed to hear from your perspective. Okay. That's I'm here to learn from you, absolutely, to get your perspective. Despite there are a lot of things in the book. In fact, let me acknowledge, despite being a Muslim, and I heard throughout my life, Ghazali is being one of the most quoted scholars among the Muslims, and almost every single Muslims, somehow they heard his name. But kind of hearing or learning about his name, about his, like collections or Ulumuddin, does not necessarily mean that most of people read it. Most of Muslims, they have never read it. They are simply
a common problem on all sides. Yeah.
So that's something I did not. In fact, prior to your recommendation of this book, I had not read this in English, even though I had some reading in Turkish as my native language, being from Turkey. But I was really truly impressed, from this. I will say. This is a kind of a chapter from Ihya Ulumuddin, but it's very well put together. There are a lot of things I highlighted. There are stories that I was completely very impressed. So I shared with my, children as well, and I also really presented to different Muslims, to kind of bring to their attentions as well. As you said, like if truth is the one, then it doesn't matter where it comes from. That's a great, I would say, principle. In fact, when you learn about something, it's very impressive. You want to share the beauty. I think the way that we are now, the social media is so popular because everyone wants to share the goodness, the wealth thing. They kind of, that's part of human nature, right? Why do we kind of share on Facebook, on the Twitter? Because we want other people to know about the things we like it, correct? And we want to be liked as well. So I believe this is our human nature. So the same way, when I see this great, Thanks Em book, when I, became familiar with that one, I was truly impressed, and I shared this with many people. But over here, I think I'd like to kind of more hear from you about like his story, the stories that in the first, couple chapters that he's telling about in Islam, I would say jihad in one way. I think the concept of jihad, the holy struggle, internal struggle, let's put it this way, the way that he defines the human beings in the nature of an empire, right? And then the way that how he puts the heart as a king, correct, and ruler of that, empire. I want to kind of really hear, your perspective on that story as well, how you kind of really, want to bring more, depthness to that story, if possible.
Sure. This, and by the way, this reminds me, I can send you, I have slides. I've presented this to a class, and I can send slides for anybody who'd like to see it, and videos and so forth. But yeah, I think, well, you mentioned jihad, and of course he mentions the famous hadith, where the prophet is some of the prophet's companions have been out fighting in a military battle, and they come back, and say how glorious it was to fight for Allah, but he says, or I may have it the other way around. Maybe he was out fighting, but he said, we've returned from the lesser struggle, jihad means struggle, to the greater. As the military jihad was a lesser jihad, and the greater jihad is interpreted as being, certainly in this classic case of Al-Ghazali, as an internal struggle, right? Struggle against sin, the struggle to find your way in the search of the soul. There's a couple of places where he suggests that, of course, the sin is around the heart, right? The heart is, and trying to understand that concept is important. Pulling some threads together. One thing he says is very important is where is what is the purpose of the heart? And what he suggests is, when you look at the big picture and look at some of the things he said, he talks about the purpose of the heart is to journey towards God and to enjoy God in an experiential way, as a personality, as someone you can know like a person, that is that mystical, spiritual kind of thing. So he has, and his definitions of these things, he kind of, they kind of overlap. So he talks about the heart, and he talks about Ruh, the spirit, and then Aql, the intellect, and then there's Nafs, he calls the appetitive or desiring soul. Now, all of this does parallel Plato quite a bit, and he's sort of bringing in more wealth of insight also from his spiritual experience. But so it might help to start there. So Plato said, the soul has three parts. It may not be components, but there's the rational part, which we can know truth. There's the what you call the spirited part, that assertive part of ourselves, that part that, at the sporting contest, we have spirit, the spirited warrior, all of those things. And then there's the desire or passionate parts, more closely associated with the body. And and this connects with Al-Ghazali falls very closely in his discussion of the king of the heart ruling over the rest, in the same way Plato does. So reason or intellect, to use Al-Ghazali's words, is supposed to rule over the passions or desires with the help of this spirited part. And to clarify it, he gives, this, as he keeps giving these similitudes, right, to the pictures, help you grasp it. So he says, okay, so think of it like a wise sage, right? And he has these wild pigs of passion. He's got to control, and so he uses the dog of anger. Anger is a classic expression of the spirited part, right? To rule and govern those pigs, to keep them in place, right? So, again, if you're looking within at your own inner self, you can see these things going on. You have these unruly passions, you have all kinds of things you're tempted to do. You could live on a higher plane, but you're pulled down, and so on. That's the pig. That's what he has. That's what he's calling the pig, right? So, food, sex, money, all of those things that you could chase after, which might be fine in themselves, but if you become obsessed with them, if you pursue those things, that's at the lower part of yourself, right? And to keep those passions under control so that you can pursue the higher journey, right? The journey to God, you have to keep those passions down. And how do you do that? Well, you need that that assertive part of yourself, right? In other words, so Plato talks about this. Socrates talks about this in terms of, he's talking about our passions, and he says, there's a weird thing I noticed, that there's a certain kind of passion that seems to be able to put down other passions. It's like, and what is that? That you're tempted, you're mightily tempted in some way, and something else in you rises up and says no, right? And he's saying that's what Plato calls the spirited part, and Al-Ghazali is likening that to a dog. So, it's kind of a, he uses the term armies. There's a military analogy there too, right? To for go back to the king analogy, for the king to enforce the laws over the people, he needs the police or the military, whatever scenario you're talking about. And what those people need to do their job is toughness, fierceness, courage, right? Those kind of qualities. And this works into certain, so there's these different parts of the self, and they have different roles, and to perform those roles well, they have to have certain qualities. It's not enough to have a rational element. The reason has to be wise. We all have reason, but we're not all wise, So, the spirited element, that part of us that can be angry and assertive, has to be controlled, right? Because that can get out of hand, as well as the rest of us. So how do we? Let me give you one more illustration. To me, is one of the most clarifying things I've heard, again from Plato, that people like Augustine, on the Christian theologian, and Al-Ghazali are sort of swirling around here. It was the notion of in one of the dialogues, there's some old man talking about, an ideal society, and the question of human nature comes up. We got to figure out what humans are like, if we're going to organize them well, and so forth. And one of the old men says, this is one of the few dialogues Socrates is not in, but one of the old men says, it seems to me that human beings are like puppets pulled by many strings from all directions. And he says it seems like there are kind of steely cords of passion, he said, which draw us down. This is the pig, right? In Al-Ghazali's, they're always drawing us down to lower things, right? But then there's what this character describes as a golden cord of reason, perhaps held by some god, as he puts it, or some divine force that gently pulls upwards. So, and that's an important distinction between the violence of the lower passions, right, and the gentleness of that upward pull. So that you might not even notice, if you're not paying attention, if you're not attuned to that, right? And so all of these are just different pictures of the same thing. The key is to live on the higher plane. You've got to direct the heart, the mind, the right way, and you've got to follow that upward path. And to be able to do that, you've got to keep those lower parts in check, right? So the old man in that dialogue says, well, it seems like the way to live well is to counterpull against the violent, steely cords of passion that are pulling you down, but let yourself be pulled by, right? Don't resist the pull of the higher cord. So now, of course, there's a much greater emphasis in Ghazali on the divine. I mean, this is, of course, one of the differences between the Greek philosophers and the Christians and the Jews and the Muslims. When they talk about these things, there's, a greater emphasis and I would argue a greater insight into the higher force that's calling them up, right? And that's where this Ruh comes in. It talks about the spirit, the Ruh. And he likens that to a mirror. You remember this mirror analogy? And that's a very important one. That was a very important one for Sufis, the classic Muslim mystics, right? And this points to that whole thing about the divine influence. It's the divine light that you're trying to reflect, right? So we can work around back to that, but I mean, maybe I should stop and ask if what I said is clear. I mean, are you guys following Al-Ghazali's basic idea of the self, or have questions about
it? I think, Scott, what you say, true with Plato and maybe the other Christian philosophers, scholars, it's interesting to see the similarities. That's because I think they all, the seekers of the wisdom, hikmah. So one thing in Islam, I think knowledge is important. Like there is a word called marifah. Marifah means that the knowledge that you kind of internalize into feeding your heart. So the knowledge is like feeding your mind, but if you turn this to your heart, that turns, if it's kind of really fits your heart, the knowledge goes to your mind, triggers your heart, that becomes marifah. It's kind of become more wisdom. So in Islam, I think that's kind of the heart is so important, because that's where there is a saying, it's called God did not place the heavens and the earth, but placed in the heart of his believer servant, you know. So that's kind of small thing that when we say heart, like one is the physical heart, the other is the spiritual heart. We are talking about spiritual heart, not the physical heart. The heart is interesting organ, just I would say, or function of the humanity. And interesting, like the most of Muslim scholars, including Al-Ghazali, when we try to understand around ourselves most of the time, and when we try to understand the world and everything else except ourselves, you know. So to kind of really have the internal journey is kind of one of the most difficult journey, you know. The external journey through, you know, many things, discovery is one way easy. Therefore, when we talk, as you refer to the hadith of Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessing upon him, the internal fight, the holy struggle, jihad is the greater jihad, where fighting in the battlefield is lesser jihad, because this is a constant part of the human nature, you know. In Islam, it is very interesting. So every moment, every human being's in constant fight internally, because there are like dynamics internally. As you said, there are different definitions or terms being coined by the Muslims, like nafs, the cardinal desires, is one of the things that kind of Muslims constantly believe, that this is part of the human nature, will lower you, you know, just kind of this lower part of your, and now your heart, your aql, your mind, your soul, it's ruh, those are kind of the higher part of you as a human being. It's a kind of constant fight, you know. What Ghazali is putting in two different parables is wonderfully, like, again, as you said, the pig, controlling the pigs, or just controlling the prisoners by the, you know, military, how it's important to have the ruler be in the ruling, not they revolve and then the prisoners get into the, you know, to the ruling of the country, then it will mess up everything. So I think this is for the Muslims, as you said, the heart is so important, because where you, according to the Muslims, where you feel God, where you do this journey to God. Therefore, when I kind of really read the book, it makes sense to me as a Muslims, the way that like every element and factor through worship and spirituality, that I try to kind of really understand now when Ghazali brought the stories together. In fact, that, you know, it kind of clarified much better about the internal and inner journey for myself, you know. But now I hear from you, I didn't know about that. It seems this is the human beings, like we have like the early Greeks, Plato, Aristotle, they have the similar journey, they have the similar kind of sickness, same thing. We have the Christians, you know, maybe, you know, scholars, early Christians, they have the same thing. It is interesting, you know, when you see all those similarities, it kind of, you know, kind of goes through same direction, try to search from the same thing, you know. Yes.
Maybe starts to make you think it's true. Yeah, I think the power of it is that you can look at what he's describing and then look in yourself and you see those same things happening, you know. Now that maybe next we could focus on that mirror image. He does so much with that. Because
here, let me just do this. Pamela put in the comments here. She said she was curious as to why, when he speaks of passions or vices, he emphasizes anger and mentions appetite in general. I suppose he could have chosen greed, lust, sloth, or something else besides anger. Did he see anger as the root of vice?
That's a great question. I mean, I think he's seeing the passions themselves as inherent and not necessarily bad in themselves. So there's a time to be angry, you know. I mean, if somebody's attacking your kid, you should get angry and stop that person, right? So it's not that anger is a problem in itself. In fact, anger plays a critical role in keeping the passions in check. I mean, you get angry with yourself, you know. It's like, stop it, you know, you can't do that. and you be a little rough with yourself sometimes if necessary, right? I mean, ideally you sort of train yourself to do it, more naturally, but that anger comes in really handy when you need it. And so, yeah, I think the way to look at it is not, the anger being a problem per se, but angry poorly used, anger poorly directed, and the same with the others, the desire for food, the desire for sex, all of the rest, all the same things we all experience. The desires in and of themselves are built in, right? It's a question of what we do with them, how we direct them, how we discipline them, and so on. So, and this was a common theme among a lot of these guys too. It was often put in terms of love. What do you, the right kind of loves and the right way to order your love? What do you love most? Do you love material comfort more than your family? Well, that's perverse, right? So you direct these. This goes to the passions, especially with the pig and so forth. You direct them, you put them in order, you put them in place, and there's a healthy way to enjoy passions, and there's unhealthy, and it depends on what you're loving, how and when, and so on, right? So that's another way to think about it. And I mean, that term that Plato uses, spiritedness, is kind of, I guess, a little more neutral. Maybe anger has, it's definitely in action, right? You're doing something. It could be just a kind of an assertiveness, but it means exactly the same thing. I mean, Al-Ghazali is talking about exactly the same thing. It's just anger is a way of putting it that we could all relate to.
I love the way you were talking about Plato and Socrates, and now Keith was talking about, we have all the prophets and things, and the conversation of this sort of way it's relayed is related slightly differently amongst all of these through history, but there seems to have always been an innate search for the inward.
Yeah.
Right. Like as he was saying, there seems to always have been, because like the way people like describe things so eloquently or fluently about, like you have said, you have these lower desires, you have this one that reach, like I wish I thought like that more. I can feel like
read this stuff, right?
As a mom, I guess I could say I feel like I'm being pulled in many ways today, but not any eloquently put way of saying I feel like I'm being pulled in many ways today. So I like the thought. I think the interesting thought is how we have always pondered this innate, like who we are-ness of ourselves. I find that very interesting.
But one thing I'm sorry, Keith.
I'm sorry, maybe Christina, follow to your question. That could be a good question to Scott. So I agree with you, Christina. I want to also see how, as a human being, to kind of always be mindful of who I am and my kind of really nature, and how I can actually be in control of the higher part of myself, not to give the control to the lower, vices part of my internal nature. So what do you recommend? What's kind of really the way that it could be possible, if not always, but maybe, most of the time? What are your recommendations, Scott, for that part?
Well, I'll go with Ghazali here. I mean, this is where the mirror comes in, right? So one of the questions that arises is, okay, so the rational element should rule over the others, but how does reason know what to do, right? How should reason be directed, right? And the mirror is the divine light. I mean, without the divine light, you don't know what to do. In fact, reason can be a very destructive force, if it's not well directed. So, and that's where when Ghazali gets into the Sufi way and how you prepare yourself to receive the light, and how you how you respond to it, and how you know. So there's all this stuff about, a mirror needs to be, to reflect light well, needs to be clean. It needs to be well polished. It needs to be in a certain condition. And so I think so. Another way you could put it is kind of spiritual exercises involved that he's suggesting. Yeah. I'm sorry. I don't tell me your name. I was gonna.
So say, go ahead. You can unmute yourself, Pamela.
Okay. Well, while you were saying all that, I was struck by, I think it was like chapter 8, which is about as far as I read. But when he talks a lot about infused knowledge, what I would call infused knowledge, that such that the prophets and the mystics get, and that there's a certain kind of knowledge that just arrives, in us because we haven't sought it, and then other knowledge that's acquired, and clearly the acquired knowledge is secondary as far as he is concerned. But it sounds as though the infused knowledge is not accessible unless one has developed certain kinds of ascetic practices, certain kinds of disciplines, and so on that you were talking about.
Well, that was actually a point of debate among some of the philosophers and theologians as to what degree, a prophet is just seized by God and not ready for it, or if they happen to be someone who had, lived in such a way that they were ready to receive that kind of message. Obviously, all of them, and the Christian and the Judaic and the Muslim traditions, see the prophets as on another level. I mean, obviously these are, sometimes Christian language, special revelation, something, no ordinary person typically has, right? But Al-Ghazali, he looks at, the prophet Muhammad, but the other prophets as well, as models, right? But he's also trying to, as Akif is kind of getting at, is he's also trying to speak of a kind of, approximation that the rest of us can have, ordinary people, that we can, we may not get as much light, it may not be as intense, it may not come with, the kind of elaborate message and so forth, but we can receive it. And so, but this is, I guess, another thing to bring in here is this element of self-examination. So, he talks about, okay, there's different kinds of hearts, and there's different conditions of the heart. And so, you have to look in and say, well, what condition is my heart in? What kind of heart do I have? And if it's, because he talks about different problems. We don't all have the same problems with our hearts. So just on page 33, he talks about 4 kinds of hearts. And I'll just, I don't know how long it is, but I could sum it up for you. There's a heart that's stripped clean. He says that's the believer's heart. There's the heart that is black and upside down. That's the unbeliever's heart. There's the heart that's hardened in a sheath of evil. So he puts that's a hypocrite. And there's the broad heart. It's broad in a bad sense. It's partly believing, partly hypocritical. So probably the unbeliever is not going to be doing a lot of the self-examination, but maybe there might be a point at which that happens, and then of course that's the opportunity for conversion. But that's the kind of self-examination. And then he looks at the problem of unreflective mirrors, right? So let me just connect this real quick to Keith. You had brought up, knowing yourself, and I think this is where the mirror helps with this, so that the divine light reveals ourselves as well as God, right? And this kind of Pamela would appreciate this, the whole biblical made in the image of God, right? We are made in the image of God, and therefore, and this is pretty similar idea in Islam, and certainly Ghazali is working with it, that because we're made in the image of God, it is possible to be a reflection of God. But we can't reflect God well if the mirror is not right, pointed in the right way and clean and so on. So, the old Garden of Eden story, Adam and Eve and everything, they were, humanly speaking, a pretty perfect image of God, but that image was distorted after sin, right? And so it didn't reflect God too well. So I think the sort of light that helps us to see the kind of being God is, and it helps us to get a sense of God's presence and so forth, it works the other way too. It's lighting us up, and so there's a kind of reflection of God within us, right? And that changes, he's suggesting that changes everything. So looking at the unreflective mirrors, and just pointing you to this is on pages 36 to 38. But he has his handy four-point list, look at the unreflective mirrors. There's the defective. It's imperfect. The mirror is broken or something like that. It's covered with filth. That's sin. That's another kind. There's turn the wrong direction. Okay, so maybe you're looking in the wrong place. Pointing toward the wrong light or whatever. You're not going to get the reflection there. And then there's veiled, blindly following erroneous beliefs. So to get a good reflection, then you got to deal with all those problems, right? I mean, again, to know that, you have to look within and see, what's going on. Do I need to polish a little bit? Do I need to turn the direction? Right? And and then he talks about levels of it. Some reflecting more. So that's where the prophet comes in. It's very typical of these guys to sort of rank, people who are closer to God and people who are farther away. The prophet's superlative, and then you have people who are pretty good, but they're not totally, and on down the list, right? So and going down to, just on a real practical level, when he starts talking about in chapter 8, and that's where I think we were supposed to stop. That's about halfway, but he starts talking about the Sufi way, right? Again, Sufi is Islamic mysticism, page 53 through 55. But he talks about preparation and waiting. So you get the mirror in the right condition, right? But, and maybe Pamela mentioned this, I can't remember, it comes when it comes, you can't just, it's not on command. It's not your light, God gives his light when he wants to, and you have to be ready for it, is the idea. So that involves a kind of putting away all the distractions, that kind of thing. He talks about something like, and Pamela would know this too, the idea of the via negativa. You see God more clearly. You come closer to God by clearing your mind of all things that are not God. And so that God is not this feeling I'm having. God is It's not me. It's not, the world. And you can, you try to clear your mind away from all of those things until you're left with just an open soul, right? Waiting to receive. And so in various parts of the book, he suggests, most of the book is just suggested, right? He doesn't really lay out a plan of, okay, here's step by step. But you can get that. You can get that with a lot of the mystical writings and the Christian and Muslim traditions. Step by step, okay, if you want to get ready for receiving divine light, here's your 10 steps to get ready. Some of them are very, very practical that way. So
I was just going to say there's a reason why there's fasting sometimes in all these different faiths, because this is a way to get rid of everything,
exactly.
All the distraction.
In fact, that you're putting the pig away for a while. Right?
Yeah.
So, right?
And if you've ever fasted, like, I know Akif, I know many have, if you've ever fasted, you know how difficult that, because an image will come into your head of something you really want and you're not having it. And you have to fight that image and get that gone. And it really is fighting the pig.
Yeah. And it takes time.
Mm-hmm.
I remember hearing this Christian Orthodox guy talking about, he was talking to his priest, and his mind was troubled and restless, and the priest told him, to sit down for, I can't remember how long, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and just say, God have mercy on me, a sinner. And he said, and just keep saying it. And he said he found it tremendously difficult at first to just sit there and do that. You'd be surprised. You get down and all the time, you think about other things come to mind, and so that's a discipline. So there's many ways to do that. Fasting is classic. That's something that
I've done
many better than most.
Yeah, I've done many things in the past, but one of the things that I did not ever do that I always wanted to try is called a Vipassana. And if you've ever heard of what a Vipassana is, it is you go to this ceremonial place that's set aside, and it's sitting in silence for 10 days. And it's just sitting in silence. You are taking a vow of silence for 10 days, and it's complete sitting inside. There's vegan food, I think, usually a lot of times. It's very, very healthy. There's movement you can do. There's different things you can do, but it's completely being in complete silence. And I always remember thinking, I would just really love to do that, to see it's just the complete inner, taking away voice, taking away all that distraction, being in a place without any of that, and just completely sitting and meditating for 10 days would be quite an interesting thing to do. If you've ever tried to meditate,
hour, right?
All these things come into your head, and it's like
it wouldn't be so hard, but it is so hard. Yeah.
And I remember a couple of years ago practicing doing this often, going, I think I figured it out. I think meditation means your mind is going through every thought and fast motion, and you're figuring it out as it's doing it, and you're just quiet doing it. Because I don't know if there's such thing as silence in here, because there's no silence in my head. And I remember going at the end of it, going, oh, now I've got it. I got it. Because there was no silence in my head every time I tried.
There is a book I'm sure that you might have heard. It's called The Power of Now, N-O-W. So it tells like all the voices in your mind is disturbance. So I think the best way to make it quiet at this point, because always the mind wants to think about the past and the future. So if you're able to kind of still your mind, that you feel the present, there where you come actually, it makes kind of very sense in the same way the heart. It's interesting. So in this, especially, 21st century, we see with all the, remember I'm an economist and I'm talking about the growth, we are obsessed with the GDP, we are obsessed with production, right? In economics, we are always measuring the data, how much we produce, how much growth we experience, this and that. So those are all kind of things is part of satisfactory, I will say, factors of our physical side. But in this 21st century, I think we kind of put behind a lot our hearts, right? The spiritual aspect of the humanity. But overall, if is the goal is satisfaction, does really it matter? It should be physical or spiritual, because most of the time, I will say the materialistic satisfaction is a very short period. It kind of really comes and goes very quick. But the spirituality, that I think it doesn't matter if you're a Christian, Muslim, whatever the kind of spiritual experience you have is more lasting. Kind of the way that you feel is more serene, is more peaceful. Therefore, when I see the scholars, they kind of put a lot of emphasis to the heart, which kind of really is where we kind of feel the spirituality. And if we kind of learn some of the lessons from them to train ourselves, to kind of discipline ourselves as we go to the, work out in the gym. So if there's a workout place to go kind of exercise with our heart, okay, here's I shape my soul and heart. Now I kind of feel, in different ways that I can feel the things that is not easy to feel. I think those are kind of the things, I want to, especially personally, train myself. I personally try to really experience those type of things, and therefore this book is, I think, it was very helpful for me, at least, to learn something in terms of helping me to exercise from time to time, how I can actually discipline myself. As Pamela said, it's very two different concepts. One is called kuvve-i ghadabiye, the sense of the anger. Remember that he puts, that's called kuvve-i ghadabiye. And the other term is being used by the mystics, they call kuvve-i shahaviye. That's where the lust, appetite, food, those type of things come into place. So there are two different terms they are using. Those are both usually are the kind of threat if you cannot control. If you cannot control, they are going to control you. So part of what the kind of Ghazali and the other Islamic mystics, they kind of really try to emphasize, to be able to control them, fasting is one of the methods basically you do. And also like to, to worship in different ways, to practice in different ways, constantly be among the people that might really remind you is in a way to kind of practice. Those are kind of great things. And maybe as a follow-up question, I know that, Scott, we don't have much time. Out of this, section, what's kind of the takeaway you want us to really go with this from the book?
That's a great. It's so packed, right? I guess what I would stress is the orientation. Trying to orient your soul, because that's part of the general preparation. I was thinking when you were talking, I'm glad you brought up a book. I'll throw a book out there too that I think is very accessible, but that I found pretty profound from a Christian perspective. But it's called The Spirit of the Disciplines by a guy named Foster, and he goes through specific spiritual disciplines like, study, prayer, fasting, all of these things. And he doesn't, he has a very flexible approach in terms of, some of these things might work better for you than others. And it's very practical. So, I think the way I like to look at these, this is what I do. I studied classics, so I just love the night. But what I try to do is, sort of get the guidelines, the principles, the markers, and this is what they all do. They don't tell you everything. They set you up, and then you try to work out the details on your own. So another way that, I always like to quote Aristotle on this. He said, I'm paraphrasing, but learn the fundamentals if you learn the fundamentals, then you can figure out the rest for yourself. And so he says, basically saying, my job is to try to teach you students, as he was, he was talking to people who were students. My job is to teach you the fundamentals. You have to fill out the details, because no one can. You can do that. Somebody can help you do that in a very detailed way if you get a sort of spiritual mentor. But otherwise, the point is that if you have a good command of the fundamentals and the things like this, what is the soul like and the different parts and how to, if you can get a solid grasp of that, then you're on the way. You just keep thinking about that and think about the practical implications. So that's what I find so valuable about some of these guys is they lay out a pathway for us. But I think it's kind of, you look at his own experience, and maybe this is a good way to finish off with on Ghazali is his own, that experience that he had of his personal crisis, and then he went, right? He realized that only that all of the study, all of the learning, all of the abstract ideas and everything he was learning, it didn't get him anywhere until he took that leap himself, right? So it's the idea of, well, the old expression, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. You got to set things up. And so I think that's the way to read books like this, just the way you already are, Keith. You're thinking, how do I apply this? How can I, make it happen? So I don't know if that's, very specific advice, but those are my thoughts.
I think it's good advice. Thank you. Thank you.
Before we wrap up, I know like the four of us have been chatting. I don't know if James or Rayan or LR or Karen had any thoughts they'd like to add real quick at the end here, because I know we're going on about an hour, so I usually like to wrap it up, but I thought I'd give them a second to share anything.
I can't really think of questions right now, but I would like to thank you for taking your time and making this lecture. I really enjoyed it. It was a wonderful discussion. I really enjoyed hearing people's questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rayan. James said great discussion. Thanks to each of you. And Karen said thank you. No additions here. And Karen, I know you just joined us late, but this was recorded. So if you want to go back and listen to it, it'll be up on YouTube tomorrow.
Sure.
All right. Thank you very much, Scott.
Thank you very much. This is great.
We will have our next discussion on this book that encompasses the whole entire book on October 5th at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time as well. Okay, so I just want to make sure everybody knows. Other than that, was there, I think you wrapped it up pretty good. I was going to say, is there anything else, any final thing?
I want to thank you, Scott. Really, thank you. It was a wonderful discussion and, brought a great perspective. Thank you for
thank you
as well. It was because of you that I kind of really